Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms from Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of Diligent Institute and host of the show. Today, I'm joined by Evelyn Dilsaver, who sits on the board of Temper Sealy, Quidel Ortho, and Health Equity, among others. Evelyn, great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. It's great to be here.
It's fantastic to have you. Well, I know you've got a lot of committee experience across these boards that you have. As you think about the different board experiences that you have, tell us a little bit about the importance of board culture. What are the trends that you're seeing there?
Yes, the NACD just published a Blue Ribbon Commission report about board culture. And it's funny, it's something that I've always looked at. When you go through board interviews, whether you're the NomGov chair and interviewing new board members or whether you're interviewing for a board yourself, one of the first things people ask me is, what's the board culture? And if you look at ESG, especially the S part that's covered in the HR committee, the S part is really about social engagement and the culture. And if we as a board feel culture is important to the organization, then it starts at the top. So a lot of boards are now paying attention to not just the culture in the organization as part of the S part of ESG, but they're also paying attention to tone at the top. What is the board culture? Can they solve problems? And if you think about how crazy our world is today, how fast things are moving, you have to have a culture that's really open to change, that's agile, that can actually have really good discussions about the tough subjects ahead. So that's what I'm starting to see a lot of boards focusing on.
Yeah, that's it's super interesting and super important right now, as you point out, with the amount of sort of chaos that's going on in the world. If you put your NomGov hat on for a minute and think about the role of that NomGov chair, how do you think about that when it comes to this notion of oversight and the importance that you just pointed out of this cultivation of a strong board culture? What is the role of that NomGov chair?
Well, in my role, I think, a non-gov chair really has to start with, where is the board? Where is the company? Because not all companies are really ready for a culture assessment, if you will, or some even don't do board assessments of either the committees or the individuals. So I'm lucky that I'm on a board where we actually will do board assessments, both at the committee level and the individual level. And the individual level, it helps to understand what are the values you're looking for that you want from a board member so that you can actually assess whether they're meeting it or not. Now, the NACD actually came out with their culture report, and in it, they had some red flags of what to look for if you've got board members that want to talk offline, want to solve issues offline. So I think a NomGov chair starts with a discussion about what culture do we want to have? What culture do we want to have in the organization, and how does that get reflected at the top of the board? And then include a couple of culture questions in the board assessments so that you can start with a baseline of, where are we? Can we identify any red flags that might exist? And if they are, do we want to change them? So I will tell you, not all boards want to do this. You have to be ready for it, and you have to have advocates on the board who are willing to support you in that role.
Yeah, I like that notion though of thinking through, how do we all have a skills matrix. We all know, okay, next board search, we're looking for someone with finance capabilities or marketing background or whatever it is. I like the idea of sort of baking that into, as a NomGov committee, what values are we looking for, and what does that look like to build the board culture that then sort of promulgates over the culture of the broader company.
Yes, and I get questions from when I'm interviewing for potential new board members. They will ask, what's the culture of the board? But they'll couch it in questions like, how do you guys solve tough issues? Or what's the relationship with the CEO and the board, which really gets to the board cultures and its values. So it's worth writing it down on paper so that when you do interview somebody, right, you can say, here's our cultures. We're transparent. We believe in open discussion. Every voice is respected. It's funny because nowadays, with everybody on their computer in the boardroom, you don't know if they're sending chat email messages to each other so that side conversation happens. But it's an important thing to bring up because I think people can feel their voice isn't heard, or there's side conversations going on and they're not part of it. So that is happens to be one of the red flags that the NACD has pointed out, is not having those side discussions, especially on your computer or your text while you're in those conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because if you're having a conversation that can't be had in front of the whole board, what does that mean? And what's the need to have it? So I think that's a really interesting call out. And, as you look at that, you mentioned board evaluations, and I always hear mixed things on board evaluations. To be honest with you, because I think some people say, well, either we don't have board evaluations and that's a bad thing, or we do have board evaluations, but it's not clear what happens with them or how candid people feel comfortable being with them. So as you look at that, how do you think about the methods and best practices here in terms of evaluating a board's culture, pulling forward that board culture to, if it's not where you want it to be, to where you want it to be, and implementing those best practice changes?
Yes, some boards like to use an outside third party, and the great thing about that, and we do on one of my boards, every 2 to 3 years, we'll use an outside third party to do the board individual peer assessments, and it makes it safe. And the outside individual is usually a coach who can then say, "Gee, Ev, here are the things that your board fellows would like you to continue to do, and here are the things that they wish you'd stop doing or do less of." And it's in a safe environment. Nobody else gets those results other than maybe the board chair, who can then reinforce it in the meeting, or sometimes maybe nominating gut. But I think that is a way to introduce it and have it be safe for board members. It's funny, Lisa, I think about, we demand peer reviews or 360 reviews of our management team and the CEO. And yet, as a board member, we don't want it. That kind of doesn't make sense to me. Of course, I've had board members say, well, I'm the boss and I shouldn't have to do it. But having said that, I think, we can all improve. And when you're getting people together in a group setting, you want to make sure that everybody's focused on the right thing, which, as a board, which is, what do we have the right strategy in place? Do we have the right team in place? And can they execute? And if you can't have that discussion because everybody has their own agenda, or they want to dominate the conversation, or they want to be the CEO, you can't have that high performance board that you're really looking for. So individual assessments from an outside third party, and then every other year or so, the board chair. And that seems to work well. The other thing we implemented was, as new board members joined, after about the first year, we would have them do an assessment. We would have an assessment of them using the third party. And we just make it a practice, because after 1 year, you can see the behaviors of the individual and whether they match the values, right? And many of them, frankly, want good feedback. When you're joining a board, you really want that feedback of, how am I doing? Um, in fact, I had one where we gave that individual feedback, several individuals feedback, and a couple of them came back to me and said, hey, could you coach me? I don't quite believe this, but if I'm doing that, coach me. And I think that's a great learning board.
Yeah, I agree. I will tell you, we get a lot of feedback because we have a group called Next Gen Board Leaders, and it's board leaders under 50. So it's often their first board, and they are craving feedback, and we all tell, we're all people leaders or former people leaders, and we all say, feedback is a gift. Take this in the spirit it's intended to improve. But then we sort of hesitate to do it on the board. So I think it's a really good call out, that especially the newer board members, the first time board members are really looking for, what is the right way to move forward and to take those best practices. So it's a really great call out. Any final thoughts as you think about, if you could sort of wave your magic wand and say, I could do something to shape a board's culture, or impart a nugget of wisdom that people can take away. Any final thoughts for our audience today?
Again, as I said before, I think you need to meet the board where it's at. And sometimes if you bring in an outside third party who can talk about board performance, board culture, what's out there, what's best practice, it will get people thinking. Especially, I know I have been on boards where they don't want to do individual board assessments. To your point, it's because they never see anything happen with it, right? So you have to find advocates on the board who want to articulate the culture and who want to make those changes. Recognize it's not going to be right away and overnight, that it'll be slow. But having said that, I find boards are really open to at least having a discussion about what are our values that we want embedded in the organization. So you measure tone at the top, measure tone in the middle, and measure tone at the bottom, right? Because that's all part of what you want to know that your company is on the path for success.
That's fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much, Evelyn, for sharing those insights from the NomGov perspective. And thank you also to our audience. We will be back next week with another edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms.